In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint these beautiful fall leaves with watercolor on the iPad. Hello and welcome to Color with Kendi. On this channel, we paint digital watercolor and gouache on the iPad, and I use the app Procreate. Most of my tutorials are step-by-step tutorials that are meant to be followed along, and I list all of the supplies that I'm using in the description as well as the pinned comment, so feel free to check that out. So for today's video, I'm using the Amazing Watercolor brush pack, and I'm going to be using the 8 by 10 inch canvas that comes with the set. So I'm just going to open that up. So this is a paper texture canvas. The layers are already ready for you, so you can start painting, and it provides a beautiful texture to the watercolor brushes. So for this video, the first thing that we're going to do is import the traceable. So I want you to just tap on the very top, as I always like to import the traceable right on the top. And let's go to the Actions menu, tap on Insert a Photo. So I've imported the traceable. Let me just tap on the Layers panel and let's turn off this Read This layer. That's where all of the brush textures are. So here we have our traceable. There is a color palette on the top as well. You can use this color palette or use colors of your choice. I just wanted to provide a starting point. I will probably change the colors as I go. That's usually what I do. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this color palette and transfer it to the color menu. So to do that, all I'm going to do is with one finger press and hold until I grab that color, then go to the color menu, and I'm on disc mode, and you see here I have something called dry paint. So what you will have here is a color palette. I want to create a new one, so I'm going to go to palettes, tap on plus, create a new palette, and then I'm going to go back to disc mode. So now I have a new palette, and I'm just going to tap to insert that color there, and I'm going to repeat with the rest of the colors. So now I have all the colors here and it's really easy to access. So now with this traceable, we are not going to be using the line art. The line art is just a guide, so we don't need to see it so dark. So let's make it a little less opaque. So let's go to the layers panel, and where we have the image, just tap on N, and this is where you can reduce the opacity and make it less visible. So that's what I'm going to do. So we're just going to use it as a guide. So I have it around 18%. So it's enough for you to see, but it's not going to be getting in the way. So we have a bunch of different leaves here, and the basic process for today is we are going to create shapes for all of these leaves, and then we're going to add on watercolor effects with brushes, watercolor brushes, as well as stamp brushes, and then we're going to add the details. It's really simple, and it's the same process for every leaf, and you can make every leaf completely different, which is the fun part. So let's get into it. So let's create shapes for all of the leaves. This is my shape maker method. This is a method in which I create a shape first and apply pigment to it, much like what you would do with wet on wet technique if you were painting with traditional watercolor. You would make your shape with water, and then you would dip your brush into pigment and then put your pigment everywhere. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So I'm going to tap on brush 27 from the Amazing Watercolor brush pack. This is the shape maker brush. I'm going to create shapes for all of these leaves. And typically I would do this with black first, just because it's a little easier to see, and then you can always change the color later. So I'm just going to show you this with black, just so it's easy for you to see. And I'm on the wrong layer, I just realized. I have to go on the paint here layer. So it's important to check that you're on the right layer. So with this brush, depending on how much pressure I apply, I can get thin and thick lines, and it has a subtle jagged edge, not too much, kind of like what you would see with watercolor. It's not a completely straight defined edge. It has a little bit of texture. So with my brush, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an outline for the leaf. And I'm trying to be a little bit more expressive with my strokes. And you can add as much detail as you want or as little. And I would suggest not trying to be too perfect, because I think the painting ends up looking a little bit more stiff that way. So as you can see, I'm using more expressive strokes and thin and thick lines. So what you want to do is just create an outline. And also let's paint that in too. And you want to make sure that your outline is completely closed. There's no gaps, because what we're going to do next is we're going to use color drop, and we're just going to drop in the color so that we have created our shape, and we can completely color in those white areas that we don't want. And that's our shape ready. So what we're going to do is the exact same step for all of the different leaves. And then we're going to make these shapes white and then apply more pigment. Because right now, if you try to apply watercolor to these shapes, it's not going to look right. You've got a black background. It's not going to be visible. So what I want you to think of this step is just apply water to your paper in the shape of the leaf, much like you do in traditional watercolor. And I'm going to do this exact same step with the rest of the leaves. Okay, so we are done our shapes, and now we don't need that traceable anymore, so I'm going to go and turn that off. So now I'm going to come back to this layer where we have all the leaves, and now we're going to start to add some watercolor effects to this and colors to this. But in order to do that, we have to turn this into white. The shapes right now, they're black. I made them black so they're easier for you to see, and I just think it's easier to make shapes in black first. Very easy to see the shape, but we can't apply any watercolor effects to this because black is not going to show the transparent layers very well. I'm going to fix this a little bit. Yeah, that looks better. So we are going to turn this into white. And the easiest way to do this is just to go to the hue, saturation, and brightness, and up the brightness to max. It's now all white. You can't really see them, but they are there. They're right here. And now what we're going to do is tap on plus to add another layer, and we are going to make this a clipping mask. And that means that anything that we paint in this clipping mask layer is only going to show up on the layer underneath. So kind of like when you paint with traditional watercolor, you make your shape with water and then you drop in the pigment. The pigment does not go outside that shape. It's the same thing here. So we are going to start to add some pigment to these leaves, and you can pick whichever colors you want. So let's go back to our color palette. So I want my base color to be this color, but slightly lighter. So I'm going to go into the color menu and go a little bit paler. I always like my base color to be paler, and then that way when I add more colors, they can become a little bit more apparent. Because if your base color is quite dark, you're going to struggle with adding more colors. So you can do this with any brush that you want. You can use the Amazing Watercolor brush pack, and you can use the brush number 30 and apply the pigment all over. But I actually want to use the stamps as well because I like to use the stamps in conjunction with the other brush set. So what I'm going to do is tap on brush number 5. This is a pigment bleed block. It has a lot of different pigment bleeds and it's a big block. So I'm going to go to the maximum size of 100. I'm going to zoom out a bit, and then I'm going to tap in the center, and it's going to paint all of my leaves together. And what I'm going to do is just kind of move this around a little bit so it's in the right place. So let's see, maybe I'll make it a tad bit bigger. I tend not to, but just a little bit bigger so it applies the pigment everywhere. So that's kind of my base color now. And then I can start to add more and more pigment. Now you could use a different brush. So let me show you. If I use a different brush, I do the same thing, make it a clipping mask. I could use number 1, which is like a simple texture block, and just tap, and it will apply a very simple texture to it. So it's totally up to you which one you use. So I'm going to go back and use this one. Okay, so that's my base layer done, and now I'm going to start to add a little bit more color. So I'm going to do that in a different layer. I like to work in different layers and then make it a clipping mask so that if I ever want to change something, I can just delete a layer. It's all on a separate layer. So let's start with this leaf right here. So it has a lot of yellow. I do want to add a little bit of brown to it. So what I'm going to do is just tap on this orange and then just go down a little bit and see what that color looks like, and maybe add some pigment bleed with brush number 27. Yeah, I kind of like that. Maybe I'll go a little bit smaller, add a little bit there. And I can also do this to a few other leaves, so depending on which ones I want to add some pigment to. Gonna add a little bit here because there's no color up here. And if you want, you can always smudge out some of that. So with the smudge tool, if you go to the smudger number 6 in the Amazing Watercolor brush pack, you can just gently smudge out some of that if you'd like to. I'm gonna go back to the brush library and let's see, I can probably add some interesting texture with brush number 40. And I'm going to show you this on this leaf here. I'm going to go in with a very pale orange. So you want to use the colors that speak to you. So I'm going to stamp that right here and maybe not cover the entire leaf. So I'm going to move my pencil a little bit outside the edge. I like that. And you see there's a little bit of this hard edge here. I don't want that. So what I'm going to do is just smudge that out. There we go. So it has a more natural looking transition. And I'm going to start to add more and more pigment to all of these leaves. And I'm just going to go with feeling. I'm not going to overthink it. And I'm going to play around with the different brushes in this pack. You can use the stamps or you can also use the brushes in the Amazing Watercolor brush pack. So I'm going to add a few more stamps. Okay, that definitely looks interesting. So I like that. And now what I want to do is add another layer, add a clipping mask, and now I just want to add a little bit more pigment where we have really pale areas, and I'm going to do this with the Amazing Watercolor brush pack. So I'm going to go back to that brush pack, and I'm going to use this brush here. This is a hard edge overlay brush, and I'm going to show you how that works. So let's go in with, so this leaf here has a lot of yellow, so I'm going to pick up that yellow, and I want to go down at a diagonal, just make it a little bit darker. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to increase my brush size to 51%, 55. And then with this brush, you apply light pressure. It starts to apply a little bit of pigment. And then if you increase your pressure, it applies a lot. And then if you don't remove your pencil from the screen, you can start to lighten the pressure and it removes some of that pigment. So then you have areas where there's a lot of pigment and areas where there's very little. So I'm going to start to do that to some of these leaves. Okay, so I'm happy with this. I can always add more detail later, but what I want to do now is I want to add in the veining. Add in the veining on a different layer. It does not need to be a clipping mask because we're drawing on the veining and we don't need it to clip exactly to the shapes underneath. It looks a little bit natural if you don't use a clipping mask for this layer. So what I want to do for the veining is go to brush number 37. This is the detail brush. I really like to use this brush. So let me show you how this brush works. So with light pressure, it kind of looks like that. If you tilt your brush, it looks like that. So keep in mind that this is tilt sensitive. And if you apply heavy pressure, you'll get a line that looks like that. So you can go thin and thick. So it creates really nice looking details and it has a little bit of a subtle watercolor edge. And what I like to do is also sometimes tilt my brush while I'm applying the pigment. So now what we will need is the line art from before, just so we can see where to add the veining, or you can do it on your own. I think it's just easier for you to use the traceable. So let's turn that traceable back on and let's name this line art. So we're just going to create a little bit of line art here for the veining. And you can use this guide as is, or you can add your own lines as well. Now the color that I'm going to pick for this is, so let's pick the main color of these leaves, which is kind of like a yellow. And then what I want to do is go down a little bit at a diagonal. And what is going to happen is it's going to be a color that has a little bit more contrast and you'll be able to see it better. I typically do that so there's enough contrast between my shape and the details. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go to brush size number 15 and then start to add the details. And I'm going to make sure that I darken the stem too. And I'm not going to be too precious about making this perfect. I'm going to use thin and thick lines. And I like to start the lines from the center and then come out. That way they can be thicker here and a little bit thinner as they come out. So now I'm going to do this with every single leaf. Okay, so at this point you might want to add some more line art. You can also change the color of the line art if you want. I'm happy with it, but I do want to add a few dots and little speckles here and there. So I'm going to do that in a different layer. And I'm just going to add very small dots here and there just to add a little bit of visual interest. That's just my style. I like to have some dots here and there. Now, the other thing you can do is you can also outline the leaves if you'd like, or there's another trick that I have that I'm going to show you. A trick to get a slightly darker outline without having to draw it in. So what we're going to do now that we have painted everything, is we're going to go to the layers panel and we are going to merge all of our layers together. Now, don't do this until you are 100% sure you like your painting and you don't want to change anything. Because once we merge everything, you can't go back and change things. Now, if you do want to create another copy of this, you can. So I'll show you what you can do. So you can basically select all of your layers, go to group, and then you can copy that group. So now we have everything in a group, everything was selected and we made a group. Go and swipe to the left, tap on duplicate, and then it will create another copy. So this is now our original. I'm going to turn that off and I'm in this new group. I am going to flatten it. So now it's all one layer. This step where we create that darker outline without drawing, it's important to have everything in one layer. So now we have everything in one layer. And what I want to do now is select everything around the shape and then feather it in just a little bit so that it starts to select the edges of our leaves. And then we will darken them. That's essentially what we're going to do. So let's do that together. So just go to the selection tool and make sure you are on automatic, and then make sure you're on add and just tap. And what it's going to do, it should select everything around your leaves. You may need to change the selection threshold by keeping your Apple Pencil on the screen and moving it up and down. That's too much. Do you see everything got selected? So that's a good selection threshold. Then what I'm going to do is tap on feather. And then just feather it out 3 inches. 3 inches, not 3 inches, 3%. So what it does is, I can't zoom in right now, but it basically will select the outer edge of your leaves. Then what we're going to do is go to adjustments, and then we're going to go to curves, and let's zoom in at this point. And just go to gamma. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another node right here. So I'm going to tap right there and keep your eye over here. And then I'm going to take this node and I'm just going to drag it down. Do you see it got a little bit darker, but it's just so subtle. It's not in your face. It's very subtle and it looks quite natural. And then I'm going to tap out and there we go. Now our leaves pop just a little more, just a little more. It's so subtle, but it makes a huge difference. Now at this point you could say, hey, I am done. Or you can continue to add a little bit more pigment here and there. So you can always do this on top of this flattened layer. There is no harm in doing that. So I'm going to add another layer. I'm going to make it a clipping mask. I might add a little bit of pigment here and there. So let me go to the pigment bleed overlay. And maybe I'll add a little bit of red in certain areas, but a darker red. I'm going to make it really small. So just like pockets of red here and there. Now I'm happy with that, and you could definitely keep on going, but at some point you have to say I'm done. So I'm done. And I hope this video was useful. If you learned something new, please do give this video a thumbs up. And if you are curious about the brush packs that I used today, you can find the link in the description as well as the pinned comment. And I will see you in the next video.